They told him it was suicide, crossing a frozen river in a blizzard on Christmas night, with barefoot men who were starving, freezing, and ready to quit. George Washington looked at his dying army and made a choice that would change history forever. The password that night wasn't victory or retreat. It was victory or death. This is the story of the men who should have lost, but refused to. This is the American Revolution, and what happened next no one saw coming. We'll explain everything in this video step by step. Don't skip it. They were farmers, blacksmiths, printers, and merchants, men who'd never held a musket in anger, boys who'd never seen blood spilled in anything more than a tavern brawl. They had no army, no navy, no treasury to speak of. What they had was a choice, to kneel or to stand. And on an April morning in 1775, at a place called Lexington, they chose to stand. The shot heard round the world wasn't fired by a general or a trained soldier. It cracked across that dawn by someone's hand. We'll never know whose. And with it, the world changed. 77 Minutemen faced down 700 British regulars on that village green. They were told to disperse. Some did, some stayed. And when the smoke cleared, 8 Americans lay dead in the grass, their blood seeping into soil they'd worked their entire lives. This is how revolutions begin, not with declarations or grand speeches, but with ordinary people who decide they've had enough. But let's be clear about what they were facing. The British Empire was the most powerful force on earth. Its navy ruled the seas, its armies had conquered nations, and now a ragtag collection of colonists, outnumbered, outgunned, outtrained, dared to imagine they could defeat it. The odds weren't just against them. The odds were impossible. George Washington knew this. When he took command of the Continental Army in 1775, he found not an army but a mob. Men without shoes, without proper weapons, without discipline. They deserted by the hundreds. They died of disease by the thousands. At Valley Forge in the brutal winter of 1777, they left bloody footprints in the snow because they had no boots. They wrapped their feet in rags. They starved. They froze. They watched their brothers die, not from British bullets, but from typhoid, dysentery exposure. Washington could have quit. God knows he had reason to, but he stayed. And more importantly, they stayed with him. These weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers who left crops in the field. Fathers who kissed their children goodbye, not knowing if they'd ever return. At Bunker Hill, they were told, don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes, not because it sounded dramatic, but because they had so little ammunition they couldn't afford to waste a single shot. And when the British came, in their perfect red lines, drums beating, flags flying, those farmers held. They fired. They reloaded. They fired again. The British fell in waves. It took 3 charges before the Redcoats took that hill, and they paid for it with over 1,000 casualties. The colonists proved something that day. They could fight. They could bleed the world's greatest army. But could they win? The darkest hours came in 1776. Washington's army was crushed in New York. They retreated across New Jersey, losing men with every step. Thomas Paine wrote by campfire light, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington read those words to his men, cold, hungry, defeated men, on Christmas night, and then he asked them to cross the Delaware River in a blizzard, in the dark, to attack a garrison of Hessian soldiers at Trenton. It was insane. It was desperate. It was exactly what they needed. They crossed that freezing river, ice chunks battering their boats. Some men didn't make it, but those who did attacked at dawn. They took Trenton. They captured nearly 1,000 enemy soldiers. They proved they weren't beaten. Not yet. But victory wasn't inevitable. It never is. At Saratoga in 1777, American forces surrounded British General Burgoyne's army, and for the first time, a British army surrendered on the field. This wasn't just a military victory, it changed everything. France, watching from across the Atlantic, decided these rebels might actually win. French ships, French soldiers, French money. The revolution had an ally. Still, the war ground on, brutal, bloody, brother against brother, because this was also a civil war. Loyalists fought patriots, families split. The southern colonies became a charnel house. At places like Camden and Guilford Courthouse, at Kings Mountain and Cowpens, Americans fought and died, often against other Americans. And the civilians, the civilians, they endured occupation, raids, their homes burned, their livestock stolen, women widowed, children orphaned, towns that had stood for generations reduced to ash. War isn't glorious when it's happening in your backyard, when it's your neighbor's blood in the street. By 1781, both sides were exhausted. The British held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, but controlled little else. Washington and his French allies saw an opportunity. British General Cornwallis had dug in at Yorktown, Virginia, his back to the sea, waiting for British ships to resupply him. Those ships never came. A French fleet blocked the bay. Washington's army and French forces surrounded Yorktown by land. For weeks, they pounded the British positions with artillery, the thunder of cannons, the screams of the wounded, the smell of gunpowder and death. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis surrendered. 7,000 British soldiers marched out, stacking their weapons as their band played The World Turned Upside Down, because that's exactly what had happened. The impossible had occurred. The colonies had defeated the empire, but victory came at a cost we must never forget. 25,000 American soldiers died. Thousands more were maimed, scarred, broken. Countless civilians lost everything. The war left scars on the landscape and on the soul of the young nation. And yet from that fire, something new was born. Not perfect, far from it. The Constitution would later be written, the Bill of Rights, a government of, by, and for the people, an experiment in democracy that continues to this day. The American Revolution wasn't won because of superior tactics or resources. It was won because ordinary people refused to give up, because farmers became soldiers, because men and women sacrificed everything for an idea, that people have the right to govern themselves, that all are created equal, that liberty is worth dying for. Were the founding fathers flawed? Absolutely. The revolution's promises weren't extended to everyone, not to enslaved people, not to women, not to indigenous peoples. Those battles would come later, are still being fought. But the fire they lit, the principle they established, that government derives its power from the consent of the governed, that fire still burns. So when you think of the American Revolution, don't think of paintings or monuments. Think of the bloody footprints at Valley Forge. Think of the farmers at Lexington who stood their ground. Think of the men who crossed the Delaware on Christmas night because they believed in something bigger than themselves. Think of what it costs to be free. They were just people, scared, cold, hungry people who could have quit 1,000 times, but they didn't. And that's why we remember them. That's why their story matters. Because the American Revolution teaches us that ordinary people, when united by purpose and conviction, can change the world, that tyranny can be defeated, that liberty is never given. It must be taken, held, defended, sometimes with blood, always with courage, and that the price of freedom is paid not once, but by every generation that inherits it. We are the inheritors of that sacrifice. What we do with it, that's our story to write. They stood on Lexington Green that April morning in 1775. 77 men against 700. Dread. The grass was wet with dew. The air carried the chill of early spring. These weren't soldiers in any meaningful sense of the word. They were neighbors, men who'd shared drinks at the tavern, who'd helped each other raise barns, who knew each other's children by name. Samuel Whittemore was 78 years old. Isaac Muzzy was a farmer. Jonathan Harrington would die on his own doorstep, crawling toward home as his wife watched. They had muskets, yes, but many were old hunting pieces, passed down from fathers and grandfathers. Some had never been fired at another human being. Across from them stood the pride of the British Empire, professional soldiers in perfect red coats, their bayonets gleaming in the morning light. These men had trained for years. They'd fought in Europe, in the Caribbean, across the globe. They moved in perfect formation, responded to orders with mechanical precision. Behind them stood the full weight of the most powerful military force the world had ever seen. The Royal Navy commanded the seas, over 100 ships of the line, hundreds more frigates and support vessels. British armies had conquered nations, toppled kingdoms, built an empire upon which the sun never set. And now these farmers, these shopkeepers, these ordinary men dared to stand in their way. The mathematics of it were absurd. The colonies had no standing army, no navy worth mentioning, no manufacturing base to produce weapons or ammunition, no central government with the authority to levy taxes or raise troops. They had 13 separate colonies, each with its own interests, its own politics, its own reluctance to sacrifice for the others. They had no military academies and officer corps trained in the European style of warfare. No logistical system to supply an army in the field. What they were proposing was madness. To fight the British Empire was to fight a machine that had been perfecting the art of war for generations. British officers studied at the finest military institutions. British soldiers drilled endlessly until their movements became instinct. British commanders had access to the latest intelligence, the best maps, the most advanced artillery. The British Treasury could afford to hire Hessian mercenaries, 30,000 German soldiers who fought with brutal efficiency. The Empire could replace losses, could ship in reinforcements from across the Atlantic, could sustain a war effort that would bankrupt any other nation. And what did the colonists have? Enthusiasm, anger, a sense of grievance. Important, certainly, but you can't win battles with righteous indignation alone. You need powder and shot. You need discipline. You need men willing to stand in formation while other men try to kill them, willing to advance when every instinct screams at them to run. George Washington understood this better than anyone. When he took command of what was optimistically called the Continental Army, he found chaos. Men elected their own officers based on popularity rather than competence. They came and went as they pleased, returning to their farms when planting season arrived. They had no uniforms, so you couldn't tell private from officer. They had no standard issue weapons, so some carried muskets, others rifles, others whatever they could scrounge. Ammunition was so scarce that powder had to be measured out in tiny portions. Food, whatever could be procured locally, which meant the army was always hungry, always on the edge of starvation. Disease killed more men than British bullets ever would. Smallpox swept through camps like wildfire. Dysentery turned strong men into hollow-eyed ghosts. Typhus, typhoid, influenza. In the close quarters of military camps, sickness spread with terrifying speed. Men who'd survived battles died shivering in tents, calling for mothers and wives who were hundreds of miles away. Desertion was epidemic. Why wouldn't it be? These men had farms to tend, families to feed. They'd signed up for short enlistments, 3 months, 6 months, expecting a quick resolution. When the war dragged on, when conditions became unbearable, they simply walked away. Washington couldn't even court-martial them all. He'd have no army left. He resorted to public floggings, to pleas for patriotism, to anything that might convince men to stay just a little longer. The British, meanwhile, operated with clockwork efficiency. Their supply ships arrived on schedule. Their soldiers received regular pay. Their officers dined on imported wine while Washington's men boiled shoe leather to make soup. When the British Army moved, it did so with organization and purpose. When the Continental Army moved, it left a trail of stragglers, deserters, and men too sick to march. At Bunker Hill, the tactical situation revealed everything. The Americans had the high ground, had fortified their position overnight. They had perhaps 1,500 men with limited ammunition. The British attacked with over 2,000 professional soldiers, supported by artillery from their ships in the harbor. The Americans were told to hold their fire, to wait until the enemy was so close they could see the whites of their eyes. Not because it made for a dramatic order, but because they literally could not afford to waste ammunition. Every shot had to count. The British came up that hill in perfect ranks, flags flying, drums beating out the cadence of their march. They came with the confidence of men who'd never lost, who couldn't conceive of losing to this rabble. And the Americans cut them down. The hillside erupted in smoke and fire. British soldiers fell in heaps. Officers died, leading their men forward. The Redcoats retreated, reformed, attacked again. Again, the Americans fired. Again, the British fell. It took 3 assaults before British discipline and superior numbers overwhelmed the American position. The colonists retreated only because they'd run out of ammunition. The British held the field, but they'd lost over 1,000 men, nearly half their attacking force. It was a victory that felt like defeat. General Clinton said of the battle that another such victory would ruin the British Army. The colonists had proven they could fight, but proving you can fight and actually winning a war are entirely different propositions. The winter of 1777 arrived early and stayed late. By December, Washington's army had retreated to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a strategic position about 20 miles northwest of Philadelphia, which the British occupied in comfort and warmth. The site was chosen for military reasons: high ground, defensible, close enough to monitor British movements, but far enough to avoid attack. No one chose it because it would be pleasant. No one imagined the hell it would become. 11,000 men marched into Valley Forge that December. They arrived exhausted, defeated, hungry. They'd been outmaneuvered at Brandywine Creek, outfought at Germantown. Philadelphia had fallen. Congress had fled. The revolution was losing, and everyone knew it. As the men stumbled into camp, many left footprints of blood in the snow. Not from wounds sustained in battle, but because their shoes had disintegrated. Months of marching had worn through leather and sole until men were walking on bare feet on frozen ground through ice and snow. Those bloody footprints became the symbol of Valley Forge, but they were just the beginning. The men had no winter quarters when they arrived. They had to build them. Imagine this: you've marched for days, you're starving, your feet are bleeding, and now you must cut down trees, shape logs, construct shelters before you freeze to death. They built crude huts, 12 by 14 feet, designed to house 12 men each. The men packed themselves inside like cordwood, sharing body heat, sleeping on frozen ground because there wasn't enough straw for bedding. The huts had gaps in the walls where the logs didn't fit properly. Wind howled through those gaps. Snow drifted in. Men woke with frost in their hair, ice on their blankets. They burned whatever they could find. Fence posts, furniture, eventually the very forests around the camp, until the landscape became barren and desolate. But there was never enough firewood. Men huddled together through long nights, shivering so violently they couldn't sleep, listening to their brothers cough and moan and sometimes simply stop breathing. The cold was relentless, but hunger was worse. The Continental Congress had no money, no credit, no way to pay for supplies. Local farmers wouldn't sell food for Continental dollars, which were worthless. They'd only accept British sterling, which Washington didn't have. The supply system, such as it was, had completely collapsed. Wagons broke down on frozen roads. Teamsters deserted. Food rotted in distant warehouses while men starved 20 miles away. Rations were cut again, cut until men were receiving a few ounces of flour and sometimes a bit of meat so rancid it turned their stomachs. They made fire cake, a mixture of flour and water cooked over flames, and ate it because it was better than nothing. They caught and ate whatever small game they could find, though the woods around Valley Forge were soon hunted bare. They boiled bones to extract whatever nutrition remained. They ate bark. They ate their own leather belts and shoes when hunger became unbearable. Dr. Albigence Waldo, a surgeon at Valley Forge, wrote in his diary, "I am sick, discontented, and out of humor. Poor food, hard lodging, cold weather, fatigue, nasty clothes, nasty cookery, vomit half my time, smoked out of my senses, the devil's in it, I can't endure it." This was a doctor, someone with better conditions than the common soldier. The men themselves had it far worse. Disease moved through the camp like a scythe through wheat. Typhoid fever, typhus, dysentery, pneumonia, smallpox, despite Washington's controversial decision to inoculate the army. In those cramped, filthy huts, with men weakened by starvation, illness spread with horrific efficiency. The hospital tents, and they were just tents, overflowed with the sick and dying. Surgeons did what they could with primitive tools and no understanding of germ theory. Men died not from British musket balls, but from infections, from fevers, from bodies simply giving up. The death toll mounted daily. 2,000 men died at Valley Forge that winter. 2,000, not in battle, but in camp. Not fighting for liberty, but shivering in darkness, calling for mothers and wives dying among strangers. They were buried in mass graves because the ground was too frozen to dig individual plots. No markers, no ceremonies, just bodies wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared, lowered into the earth, covered over, and through it all, the question that haunted every man: why stay? Why not simply walk away, go home, survive? Desertion would have been rational, even moral. These men owed nothing to a Congress that couldn't feed them, to a cause that seemed lost. The British in Philadelphia were warm, well-fed, hosting balls and parties. Officers danced with local women while Washington's men died in the snow. The contrast was obscene. Some did desert. Hundreds slipped away in the night, heading home or to the British lines where at least they'd be warm and fed. Washington couldn't blame them, couldn't really punish them. Court-martial a starving man for wanting to live, execute a soldier for choosing his family over a failing revolution. He did what he had to do, made examples when necessary, flogged deserters when he caught them, but his heart wasn't in it. He was asking the impossible, and he knew it. Yet most stayed. This is the part that defies easy explanation. Most stayed in those frozen huts, stayed through the hunger and disease and death. They stayed when their enlistments expired, and they had every legal right to leave. They stayed when their feet were wrapped in bloody rags, when their ribs showed through their skin, when they watched their friends die and knew they might be next. Martha Washington came to Valley Forge that winter. The general's wife, who could have remained safe and comfortable, chose to join her husband in that place of death. She nursed the sick, mended clothes, organized women to help where they could. Her presence meant something. If the general's wife wouldn't abandon them, how could they abandon each other? Baron von Steuben arrived in February, a Prussian military officer who'd come to help. He found not an army, but a collection of men who'd forgotten how to be soldiers if they'd ever known. He drilled them in the snow, in the cold. He taught them to march in formation, to maneuver as units, to load and fire with precision. He cursed at them in German and French, and they learned. They became something resembling a professional army, forged in the worst conditions imaginable. But the cost, God, the cost. Those bloody footprints in the snow, the mass graves, the men who survived but were never whole again, who carried Valley Forge in their bones and their nightmares for the rest of their lives. They could have quit. They should have quit. By any rational measure, staying was suicide. Yet they stayed, and in staying, they kept the revolution alive through its darkest hour. The situation in late December 1776 was catastrophic. Washington's army had been crushed in New York, driven across New Jersey in a humiliating retreat that seemed to have no end. Men deserted in droves. Entire regiments simply melted away as soldiers slipping off into the woods to walk home. The British pursued relentlessly, capturing supplies, prisoners, territory. General Howe's forces seemed unstoppable, their red coats appearing on every horizon, driving the Continental Army backward, always backward, until there was barely any army left to speak of. By the time Washington reached the western bank of the Delaware River in early December, he commanded perhaps 3,000 effective troops. Maybe. It was hard to get an accurate count because men were leaving every day. Their enlistments were expiring. December 31st loomed like a death sentence. On that date, the majority of remaining soldiers had every legal right to go home, and most planned to do exactly that. The revolution would end not with a grand battle, but with men simply walking away from a lost cause. Thomas Paine was there in that disintegrating army, serving as a volunteer aide. He watched strong men break down and weep. He saw the despair in Washington's eyes during council meetings where there were no good options, only degrees of defeat. And Paine, who'd spent his life writing, who believed in the power of words, sat down by a campfire and began to write. "These are the times that try men's souls," he wrote, his fingers nearly frozen around the pen. "The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman." Washington ordered those words read aloud to every unit. Men huddled around fires, shivering in threadbare coats, listened as officers read Paine's words. "Tyranny like hell is not easily conquered. Yet we have this consolation with us that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph." The words spread through the camp. They didn't change the military situation. The army was still beaten, still starving, still on the verge of disintegration. But they changed something in the men's hearts. Or perhaps they simply articulated what some already felt, gave voice to a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Washington knew he needed a victory, not a strategic victory. Those seemed impossible now. But something, anything, a sign that the cause wasn't dead, that resistance was still possible. His intelligence network reported that Hessian troops were garrisoned at Trenton, across the Delaware River in New Jersey. German mercenaries, professional soldiers hired by the British Crown. About 1,500 of them settled in for the winter, confident that fighting season was over and the rebels were finished. The plan Washington conceived was born of desperation. On Christmas night, he would take his army across the Delaware River, march 9 miles to Trenton, and attack at dawn. It was madness. The river was clogged with ice. A winter storm was brewing. His men had no winter clothing, inadequate food, worn-out boots or no boots at all. They would be marching and fighting in conditions that should ground any army. And they'd be attacking professional soldiers who, despite their post-holiday celebrations, were still trained killers who knew their business. His officers argued against it. The risks were insane. If the Hessians detected the crossing, if the army got trapped on the New Jersey side with the river at their backs, if the weather turned worse and expected, any of these would mean annihilation, and even if everything went perfectly, they'd be attacking a fortified position with exhausted, half-starved men. But Washington was past caring about risks. Doing nothing meant the army would dissolve on December 31st. This was a gamble, but staying put was certain death. Christmas Day 1776 was bitterly cold. The men knew something was planned, but not what. They were formed up as afternoon faded to evening, standing in formation as snow began to fall. Light at first, then heavier. The wind picked up, driving snow into their faces. Washington's orders were read. They would cross the river that night, attack Trenton at dawn. Each man was to attach a piece of white paper to his hat for identification. In the darkness and confusion, the password would be victory or death. Not victory or retreat, not victory or try again later. Victory or death. They marched to the river as darkness fell completely. The snow was coming down hard now, a full northeaster, the kind of storm that makes sensible people seek shelter. These men were marching into it. They reached McConkey's Ferry around 6 in the evening. The boats were there, large Durham boats designed for hauling freight, flat-bottomed and sturdy. They'd have to make multiple trips to get everyone across. Washington planned to have the entire force on the New Jersey side by midnight, allowing enough time to march to Trenton and attack before dawn. Nothing went according to plan. The river was worse than expected. Ice chunks, some the size of wagons, swept down the current. The boats had to navigate between them, oarsmen straining, sometimes using poles to push ice away from the hulls. The wind screamed. The snow fell so thick you couldn't see 10 feet. Men climbed into boats and immediately began shivering uncontrollably. Water splashed over the sides, soaking already inadequate clothing. Some boats nearly capsized when ice slammed into them. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment, fishermen from Massachusetts, manned the boats. These men knew water, knew boats, and even they struggled. They poled and rowed and cursed, fighting the current and ice for every foot of progress. The crossing that should have taken a few hours stretched on and on. Midnight came and went. The entire army wasn't across. 1 in the morning. 2. Men stood on the New Jersey shore, soaked through, freezing, waiting for their units to assemble. Ice formed on their clothes, their weapons, their hair. Washington watched from the New Jersey side, having crossed earlier, as boat after boat struggled through the darkness. His careful timeline was destroyed. They wouldn't reach Trenton before dawn now. The advantage of surprise might be lost. Some of his officers suggested calling it off. They were hours behind schedule. The men were already suffering from exposure, and they still had 9 miles to march through a blizzard. But Washington refused. They'd come this far. They'd crossed the river. There was no going back. The last boats landed around 3 in the morning. The entire crossing had taken 9 hours instead of 4. Men formed into columns on the snowy riverbank, their sergeants calling out in hoarse whispers, trying to assemble units in the darkness. Washington split his force into 2 columns that would approach Trenton from different directions. He gave the order to march. 9 miles through a blizzard, in the dark, with men who were already exhausted, already frozen, already at the limits of human endurance. The roads were sheets of ice. Men fell, struggled back to their feet, kept moving. Some couldn't feel their feet anymore. Some left those bloody footprints again in the snow. Officers moved up and down the columns, urging men forward, helping those who stumbled, watching for anyone who simply sat down in the snow to rest, because resting meant dying. 2 men did die on that march, not from enemy action, but from exposure. They froze to death walking, their bodies giving up, hypothermia shutting down their systems. Their comrades couldn't even stop to bury them properly. They laid the bodies by the roadside and kept marching. The living had to keep moving, or they'd join the dead. General Sullivan sent word to Washington that many of the men's muskets were too wet to fire. The powder was soaked. The flints wouldn't spark. Washington's reply was simple: tell General Sullivan to use the bayonet. I am resolved to take Trenton. Use the bayonet. Charge professional soldiers with nothing but cold steel, because there was no other option left. As dawn broke on December 26th, the 2 American columns approached Trenton from the north and east. The Hessians were indeed unprepared, not drunk, as legend sometimes claims, but certainly not expecting an attack in such weather. When the first shots rang out, confusion reigned. The Hessians scrambled to form defensive positions, their officers shouting orders, but the Americans were already in the town, coming from multiple directions. The battle lasted less than an hour. Hessian resistance collapsed under the unexpected assault. Colonel Johann Rall, the Hessian commander, was mortally wounded, trying to rally his men. Almost 900 Hessians surrendered. American casualties were minimal, a few wounded, none killed in action. Only those 2 men who'd frozen on the march. Washington had his victory. Against all odds, against reason itself, men who shouldn't have been able to cross that river, shouldn't have survived that march, shouldn't have had the strength to fight, had done all 3. The summer of 1777 found the British implementing what they believed was a war-winning strategy. General John Burgoyne would lead an army south from Canada through the Hudson Valley, while General Howe would move north from New York City. They would meet somewhere in the middle, cutting New England off from the rest of the colonies. It was elegant on paper, a classic pincer movement that would split the rebellion in 2 and allow the British to defeat each section separately. Burgoyne called it his grand campaign, confident it would earn him glory and end the war. Burgoyne set out from Canada in June with over 7,000 men, British regulars, German mercenaries, loyalist militias, and Native American allies. He also brought something that would prove his undoing, an enormous baggage train, wagons loaded with supplies, yes, but also his personal effects, fine china, cases of champagne, his mistress's wardrobe. Burgoyne fancied himself a gentleman warrior, and he intended to campaign in style. This wasn't just arrogance, though there was plenty of that. It reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of the kind of war he was fighting. The campaign started well enough. Burgoyne captured Fort Ticonderoga in early July, a significant American position on Lake Champlain. The fort was thought to be nearly impregnable, but Burgoyne's engineers managed to haul artillery up Mount Defiance overlooking the fort, and the American garrison evacuated rather than be trapped. British officers celebrated. Burgoyne sent word back to London predicting the rebellion would collapse within weeks. King George himself supposedly exclaimed, "I have beat them. I have beat all the Americans." But taking a fort and conquering a continent are different propositions. As Burgoyne pushed south into New York's wilderness, his army began to slow. The baggage train stretched for miles, requiring constant maintenance and protection. The roads, such as they were, proved inadequate for heavy wagons. Trees had to be cleared, bridges built, swamps crossed. What should have taken days stretched into weeks. The army crawled forward at a glacial pace, sometimes covering only a mile a day. American forces under General Horatio Gates and Benedict Arnold employed what we might call guerrilla tactics, so they wouldn't have used that term. They felled trees across roads, destroyed bridges, fortified defensive positions, and then abandoned them, forcing Burgoyne to waste time preparing assaults on empty fortifications. Local militias harassed British supply lines, picking off stragglers, attacking foraging parties. Burgoyne's Native American allies, who'd been promised plunder and glory, began drifting away as the campaign bogged down into tedious siege work and ambush avoidance. Then came the disaster at Bennington. Burgoyne needed supplies, particularly horses for his cavalry and draft animals for his wagons. He dispatched a force of about 700 men, mostly Hessians, to raid Bennington, Vermont, where intelligence suggested supplies were stored and resistance would be minimal. The intelligence was catastrophically wrong. American militia forces, numbering over 2,000, surrounded and destroyed the Hessian column. Nearly 200 were killed and 700 captured. It was a stunning loss, and it demonstrated that Burgoyne's army was vulnerable, that the Colonials could win against professional European soldiers. News of Bennington spread through New York and New England like wildfire. Suddenly, militia companies that had been reluctant to mobilize began marching toward the Hudson Valley. Farmers grabbed their muskets, shopkeepers closed their stores. Within weeks, thousands of additional American forces were converging on Burgoyne's position. The British general found himself in an increasingly desperate situation. Deep in enemy territory, his supply lines stretched impossibly thin, surrounded by a growing American army, with no sign of Howe's forces coming north to link up as planned, because Howe had changed his mind. Instead of marching north up the Hudson, he'd decided to capture Philadelphia, the rebel capital. He'd sailed his army south, leaving Burgoyne to fend for himself. No one had bothered to inform Burgoyne of this change in plans. He kept pushing south, kept waiting for reinforcements that would never come, kept believing the overall strategy was still in effect. By September, Burgoyne's army had reached Saratoga, about 30 miles north of Albany. The American forces, now numbering of 10,000, had established strong defensive positions on Bemis Heights, overlooking the only road south. Burgoyne had to attack or retreat, and retreat would mean abandoning the entire campaign in humiliating failure. On September 19th, he ordered an assault. The Battle of Freeman's Farm became a brutal slugging match. British troops attacked in traditional European fashion, tight formations, disciplined volleys, bayonet charges. The Americans, many fighting from behind trees and improvised fortifications, poured fire into the advancing redcoats. Benedict Arnold, though technically not in command that day due to a dispute with Gates, rode into the thick of combat anyway, rallying troops, directing attacks, fighting with reckless courage. The battle raged for hours, neither side gaining decisive advantage. When darkness fell, both armies held essentially the same ground they started with, but the British casualties were far heavier, nearly 600 killed or wounded, compared to fewer than 300 American losses. Burgoyne's situation was now critical. He'd lost men he couldn't replace. American forces continued to grow as more militia arrived. His supplies were running dangerously low. He waited 3 weeks, hoping for word from New York, hoping for relief forces that never materialized. His men were on reduced rations. Horses were dying from lack of fodder. The nights were getting colder. October in upstate New York can be brutal, and the soldiers lacked adequate winter clothing. On October 7th, Burgoyne tried one more assault, a reconnaissance in force to probe American defenses and potentially find a weak point. It was desperation dressed up as tactics. The Americans were ready. Arnold again rode into battle, this time directly defying Gates's orders. He led charges against British positions, his presence electrifying the American troops. A massive assault broke through British lines at multiple points. Arnold's horse was shot from under him, and he suffered a severe leg wound, but the damage was done. The British right flank collapsed. Artillery was captured. Entire units fled in disorder. Burgoyne retreated north, back towards Saratoga, but found his way blocked. American forces had moved during the battle to cut off his escape route. He was surrounded, completely surrounded. His army of over 7,000 professional soldiers, the pride of the British Empire, was trapped in the wilderness by a force of Colonial militia and Continental Army regulars. For 10 days, Burgoyne held out, hoping for a miracle. His men dug defensive positions in the cold rain. They slaughtered the last of the horses for food. They watched the American positions grow stronger each day, more artillery appearing, more troops arriving. Disease spread through the crowded British camp. Morale collapsed. Officers began discussing terms of surrender. On October 17, 1777, Burgoyne met with Gates to negotiate. The British general tried to maintain dignity, insisting on being granted the honors of war. His troops would march out with flags flying, drums beating, and would only symbolically surrender by stacking their arms rather than throwing them down in submission. Gates, who had his own political considerations and wanted to seem magnanimous in victory, agreed to surprisingly generous terms. Burgoyne's army would be marched to Boston and shipped back to Britain on the condition they never again serve in North America. The formal surrender ceremony took place that afternoon. British and German soldiers, nearly 6,000 of them, marched out of their fortifications in full uniform. They stacked their muskets in neat pyramids. Their officers surrendered their swords, Some wept openly. Others stared straight ahead, faces rigid with shame. It was the first time in modern history that a British army had surrendered on the field to a colonial force. The news reached London in early December. The reaction was shock, disbelief, then panic. This wasn't supposed to be possible. British armies didn't surrender to rabble. The political implications were immediate and severe. Lord North's government faced withering criticism. Military leaders were called before Parliament to explain the disaster, but the most significant impact was in Paris. The French court had been watching the American rebellion with interest, but also skepticism. Could these colonials actually win? Would supporting them be worth the enormous cost? Saratoga answered those questions. Benjamin Franklin, who'd been in Paris for months trying to secure French support, suddenly found doors opening that had been closed. The French saw an opportunity to weaken their old enemy Britain, to avenge defeats in the 7 Years' War, to reclaim some measure of global prestige. On February 6, 1778, France and the American colonies signed formal treaties of alliance and commerce. France would provide military support, troops, ships, money, supplies. French naval power would challenge British control of the seas. French officers would train American forces. French loans would keep the Continental Army in the field. The American Revolution had become a global war, and Britain now faced enemies on multiple fronts, all because a British general underestimated his enemy, overextended his supply lines, and found himself surrounded in the forests of upstate New York. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.